Zareth stood at the edge of the arena, her gaze locked on the massive crowd before her. The vast amphitheater stretched out in all directions, filled with creatures from hundreds of planets. Their murmurs rippled through the air like waves, rising in volume as anticipation hung thick. The League of Intergalactic Combat had arrived at its zenith. For the first time in history, an alien princess would compete in the legendary event. Not just any princess. Zareth, heir to the Garva dynasty. Her heart beat with a steady, controlled rhythm. She had fought in countless battles. Trained since childhood by the greatest combat masters of the Garva, her body was a weapon forged in the fires of tradition and royal necessity. Every battle, every sparring match had led to this moment. But still, there was something different about this one. She turned to her personal aide, an older Garvan named Ver, who had accompanied her through every military campaign and political negotiation. His gray eyes were filled with a mix of pride and concern, a rare combination. "Are you certain you want to go through with this, princess?" Ver asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "The humans are unpredictable." Zareth didn't answer immediately. She simply stared out across the arena, where the competitors would soon emerge. The air was thick with the scent of alien species, their sweat, their heat. A unique feeling pervaded the space, a tension in the air that vibrated just beneath her skin. "I've fought against thousands," she finally said, her voice cold and resolute. "I'll defeat this human just like the others." Ver's brow furrowed, but he said nothing more, sensing the finality in her tone. As much as he had trained her for combat, the unpredictability of humans troubled him. They were not like any species he had encountered before. Their brute strength was matched only by their unyielding will, something that could not be measured in a battle of physical strength alone. At the center of the arena, a large, holographic screen flickered to life, announcing the start of the match. Zareth's name was displayed in bold, shimmering letters. Zareth, Princess of the Kthar, champion of the Garva dynasty. Beneath it, in smaller letters, the human's name appeared. Jack Cooper, human, with a subtext that read, "Underdog." The crowd responded with a cacophony of roars and whistles, many of them in support of the human. Zareth could feel their gaze, the weight of their expectations pressing against her like an invisible force. She was a symbol of power of her people and of everything her dynasty represented. She would not fail them. Her eyes moved to the other side of the arena, where her opponent stood. Jack Cooper was nothing like she had imagined. The human was tall, well-built, his muscular frame standing in stark contrast to the delicate, elegant shapes of the other species in the crowd. His hair was short and unkempt, his face expressionless, almost bored. Yet, there was something in his eyes, an intensity that made Zareth's pulse quicken, though she was careful not to show it. He was waiting, not for her to make the first move, but for the right moment. The referee, a six-armed being from the planet Ulkov, raised a glowing stick high in the air. Silence fell over the arena, the stillness oppressive. "Combatants," the referee's voice boomed, "prepare for battle." Zareth took a deep breath, stretching her long, sleek limbs. Her muscles rippled under her skin, the familiar tension of combat flooding her body. She felt ready, more than ready. She had fought in the most vicious arenas in the galaxy, with opponents far more dangerous than this human. But what troubled her was something Ver had mentioned earlier. Humans were known for their sweat. It was said that their sweat carried an unusual property, a mixture of physical and mental endurance that could be harnessed in ways Zareth had never encountered. The crowd's roars grew louder, and without another word, the battle began. Zareth darted forward, moving with fluid grace, her body a perfect blend of strength and agility. She had seen human combat techniques, brutal, direct, and surprisingly efficient. But she had 1,000 years of heritage behind her, and every strike she made was calculated and devastating. But Jack didn't move like she expected. He sidestepped with a smoothness that suggested he had seen her attack 1,000 times before, his body responding before his mind even processed emotion. He wasn't fast, not in the way Zareth had seen other fighters move. But his strength, his resistance, it was something else. She attempted a low sweep to knock him off balance, but his legs twisted, avoiding her strike with surprising flexibility. With a sudden shift, Jack grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him with a force that threw off her stance. Zareth staggered, eyes widening as she struggled to break free. She could hear the crowd cheer as he held her tight, but she wasn't about to lose control so easily. In one fluid motion, she twisted her body, using her weight to leverage against his. With a sharp twist, she broke free, but not before she noticed something strange. As her skin brushed against his, she could feel it, the texture of his sweat. It wasn't like the perspiration of other species. It was thick, almost viscous, and had an odd quality that made her skin tingle. Zareth staggered back, trying to shake off the sensation. But the more she fought, the more she realized that Jack's sweat wasn't just a bodily function. It was a force, a substance that gave him an unnatural resistance to her moves. It wasn't just strength he was tapping into. It was something deeper, something primal. Their sweat is what? She barely had time to process the thought before Jack lunged at her again, this time quicker than she had anticipated. His hands gripped her shoulders, his sweat-slick skin making it difficult for her to break free. She was beginning to lose control, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. She gritted her teeth, feeling the human's forceful grip tighten. There was no room for hesitation now. It was just her and him. She would have to dig deeper than ever before. But that strange sensation, the texture of his sweat, the way it seemed to resist her strength, lingered in her mind. Was this the key? The secret to his endurance? The match had only just begun, and already Zareth realized she was facing something entirely new, something she had never encountered before, and it would change everything. The arena felt hotter now. Zareth wiped her brow, trying to focus, but the sensation of the human's touch lingered on her skin. His sweat, thick and strangely adhesive, had left an imprint on her. She had fought in the most brutal battles across the galaxy, faced enemies far more vicious than this human. But nothing about this felt familiar. Nothing about Jack Cooper was as she expected. The crowd's cheers intensified as the bell rang, signaling the next round. Zareth stood tall, her body primed for action. She was the princess of the Kthar, a warrior without equal, but now she was uncertain. This human, his sweat, his stamina, his almost feral ability to adapt, was beyond anything she had ever fought before. Jack Cooper, on the other hand, was unfazed. His eyes locked onto her with an intensity that reminded Zareth of a predator's gaze, focused, calculating, and utterly unrelenting. The way he moved, the way he seemed to understand her every shift in posture before she made it, it unnerved her. He wasn't just reacting. He was anticipating. Zareth took the initiative. She surged forward, aiming a powerful kick at Jack's midsection. The move was swift, precise, but Jack was ready. With an almost casual ease, he caught her leg, spinning her in the air before slamming her onto the ground with a thud. The impact rattled her, and for a moment, Zareth could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her vision blurred, but her training kicked in immediately. She rolled to her feet, her eyes narrowing as she faced Jack once more. "Not bad," she said, the words slipping out more to reassure herself than to mock him. Her pride as a warrior wouldn't allow her to admit what she was already starting to understand. This human was no ordinary opponent. Jack grinned, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "I've been called worse," he said, his voice rough but confident. His words carried a weight, a challenge that made Zareth's blood boil. She hated being mocked, especially when she couldn't pinpoint why she felt so off balance. She charged again, faster this time, determined to take him down. Her fists came at him like twin meteors, but Jack blocked them with a surprising fluidity, catching her strikes with ease and redirecting her momentum. His body, slick with sweat, made him almost impossible to hold on to. Every time she tried to seize him, his skin slipped from her grasp. She had never encountered anything like it. He's too slippery, Zareth thought. The sweat, it wasn't just a cooling mechanism, a natural bodily function. It was as if Jack's very sweat was turning him into something otherworldly. It didn't just lubricate his movements. It made him more resistant to force, more adaptable to her style. With a sudden movement, Jack ducked under her outstretched arm and wrapped his own around her waist. Zareth's eyes widened as he lifted her off the ground with what seemed like little effort. For a fleeting moment, she was weightless, her feet dangling in the air as Jack twisted, preparing to slam her onto the mat. But Zareth wasn't helpless. With a growl, she drove her elbow into Jack's side, and with a grunt of effort he staggered. She broke free from his hold and landed on her feet, her body now burning with a primal energy. She could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down her own skin, mingling with Jack's presence. She didn't have the luxury of stopping. His sweat was already starting to affect her too, thickening the air around them, like it carried a charge that made the fight feel more intense, more immediate. She could taste it now, the sharp tang in her throat. Her muscles screamed for control. She had to focus. Zareth lashed out with a spinning kick, aiming directly for Jack's head. But Jack's reaction time was instantaneous. He ducked beneath her leg and grabbed her by the ankle, sending her crashing to the mat once more. The crowd roared, half of them in shock, the other half cheering the human's unexpected skill. Zareth growled, frustrated and breathless. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Her mind raced, trying to analyze what had gone wrong. Every move she made was countered. Jack was using her own momentum against her, slipping through her defenses like a shadow. His sweat, it was acting like a shield, a second layer of armor that resisted her attacks. She had felt it when they first locked up, but now it was undeniable. His sweat wasn't just a bodily byproduct. It was somehow enhancing his strength, his resilience, and even his agility. Zareth rolled away, springing back to her feet. She was quick, but Jack was just as quick. The human was no longer just surviving. He was thriving. Her breathing was labored, her limbs growing heavier with each passing second. Sweat poured down her forehead, mixing with Jack's, and she could feel the charge in the air intensify. "You're not bad," Jack said, his voice thick with exertion. "But I've faced worse than you." Zareth narrowed her eyes, determination hardening in her chest. She would not be beaten by this human. No matter the strange properties of his sweat, no matter how unpredictable he was, she would find a way to win. Her movements were becoming more instinctual now, each strike more desperate, as if she was reaching into her deepest reserves of energy. But Jack was no longer playing defense. He was closing in, his body weaving around hers with a fluidity that was almost hypnotic. Zareth's heart raced in frustration. She couldn't rely on speed alone. She needed to outthink him, outmaneuver him. The human sweat, his strange resilience, was becoming a barrier she couldn't break. She would have to find another way. Then, in an unexpected flash, she remembered the one thing her Garva instructors had always told her. Strength is not just in the body. It is in the mind. Zareth wasn't going to overpower him. She wasn't going to outlast him in the traditional sense. But there was one thing she could do: outthink him. She feinted to the left, making Jack react instinctively. As he moved to counter her, Zareth spun behind him, using his own momentum against him. With a swift motion, she attempted to pin him to the ground. But once again, Jack's sweat turned the tide. His body slipped from her grip like oil, and before Zareth could react, he spun around, locking his arms around her waist and tossing her onto her back. She gasped as the force of his throw took her breath away. Her back slammed into the mat with a resounding thud, and for the first time in the match, Zareth felt the weight of defeat settle on her. Their sweat is what? Zareth lay on the cold, hard mat, her breath coming in short gasps. The crowd's uproar seemed distant now, their cheers a murmur in the background as her mind raced. Her body ached, her limbs sore from the relentless exchange. But what stung more was the feeling of defeat creeping in. She had been bested, Not by strength, not by skill, but by something she couldn't fully comprehend. Jack Cooper wasn't just a human. He was something different. She pushed herself up, her hands pressed against the mat for support as her head swam with the intensity of the match. Her body was telling her to rest, to retreat, but her mind refused. The Garva blood in her veins ran hotter now, fueled by a fury that would not be quenched. She was Zareth, heir to the Kthar, and she would not fall to a human, no matter how strange his sweat or his strength. Across from her, Jack stood with his chest heaving, his eyes focused on her every move. Sweat covered his body, but this time, Zareth noticed something else. It wasn't just the slickness of his skin that gave him an edge. His entire posture had shifted. There was an air of quiet confidence in his stance now, a dangerous calm that made her realize just how much she had underestimated him. "You okay, princess?" Jack called out, his voice light, but filled with a challenge. Zareth's eyes flashed. "Princess?" Her pride surged to the forefront. She was not here to be mocked. She was here to win. She pushed herself to her feet, her muscles protesting the movement, but her resolve was stronger. She wasn't about to let this human think he had control over her. "Don't get too comfortable," she snapped, brushing the sweat from her brow. "This match is far from over." Jack's grin widened, and he raised his fists, ready for the next exchange. But Zareth had learned something crucial in that last moment. She had been fighting instinctively, relying too much on her physical training. But now, she needed to fight smart. This human, this Jack Cooper, was different from any opponent she'd faced. His strength wasn't in his muscles alone. It was in the resilience of his body. His sweat acted like a second layer of armor, an insulating shield that made him more durable and gave him an almost unnatural resistance to pain. It was a strange phenomenon, and Zareth could feel the weight of it every time she made contact with him. But she was clever. She was not going to fall into the trap of fighting brute force against force. She would outwit him. With a sudden burst of speed, Zareth dashed forward, throwing a feint to the left before quickly spinning to the right. Jack, predictably, shifted to block the move, but Zareth had anticipated that. She ducked under his outstretched arm, her body low to the ground, and aimed a sharp kick at the back of his knees. Jack faltered for a moment, but his sweat seemed to give him an odd resilience. The force of her strike barely slowed him down. Instead, he turned quickly, catching her leg mid-kick and using the momentum to lift her into the air. "Nice try," Jack said, but there was a hint of admiration in his voice. Zareth's feet dangled for a second before he threw her over his shoulder in a move so fluid and fast. She barely had time to brace herself. Her body collided with the mat once more, the air knocked out of her lungs. She gasped for breath, struggling to push herself up, but Jack was already there, looming above her like an unyielding force. "You're stronger than I expected," he said, "but you can't keep pushing yourself like this. You've got to know when to adapt." Zareth glared up at him, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. His words stung, but they rang true. She wasn't just fighting to win anymore. She was fighting to understand. The strange power of his sweat, the way it made him almost immune to her attacks, had thrown her off balance. But there was more to it than that. It wasn't just his sweat that made him resilient. It was his will, his determination to adapt, to endure. She had been too focused on his body, on his strength, but now she saw the true nature of his advantage. Jack wasn't just using his body to resist her. He was channeling his endurance through his sweat, his focus, his sheer tenacity. It wasn't just about physical power. It was about persistence, the kind of resilience that came from deep within. His sweat wasn't a defense mechanism. It was his spirit manifesting itself in a physical form. Zareth's eyes narrowed as she pushed herself back to her feet. She had underestimated him, but that mistake was not going to define her. She wasn't just going to fight smarter. She was going to fight differently. "You may have endurance, Jack Cooper," Zareth said, her voice cold, "but I have 1,000 years of warfare and strategy behind me." Jack didn't reply, but the challenge in his eyes was clear. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't even trying to show off. He was simply in the moment, letting his body guide him while his mind remained focused. The sweat glistened on his skin, but it wasn't just a substance anymore. It was an extension of his strength, his purpose. Zareth was beginning to realize something that sent a chill down her spine. Humans were not as primitive as they appeared. Their greatest strength wasn't their physicality. It was their adaptability. And Jack, with his strange sweat, was living proof of that. She closed the gap between them, but this time, she wasn't just relying on her speed or her strength. She was relying on something else. The power of understanding. Zareth moved like a shadow, slipping past Jack's defense in a series of precise strikes designed not to overpower him, but to tire him out, to stretch his endurance. For the first time in the match, she saw a crack in his focus. Jack staggered as one of her hits landed against his ribs, the force of it shocking his body. Jack grunted, but he recovered quickly, his body still moving with unnatural agility. His sweat, thick and glistening, seemed to flow in a pattern that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. It was as if his body and mind were in perfect sync, each movement a testament to his sheer willpower. Zareth could see it now. This wasn't just a fight of strength. It was a fight of wills. And for the first time, she began to wonder if her will could truly overcome his. The sweat, their sweat, was more than just a physical manifestation. It was the essence of their battle, the struggle between two beings with two different kinds of strength. One, a calculated warrior with centuries of experience. The other, a relentless human whose persistence seemed to transcend the physical. "Not bad, Princess," Jack said again, his voice laced with respect. "But you're not there yet." Zareth's lips curled into a tight smile. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Zareth wiped the sweat from her brow as she squared off against Jack once more. Her body was a canvas of bruises, each one a testament to the intensity of the battle. The match had stretched on far longer than she had anticipated, and every movement now felt like it was fighting against her own exhaustion. But her pride, her determination, refused to let her give up. She was Zareth, heir to the Cathar dynasty, and she would not lose to this human. No matter how strange his sweat, no matter how adaptable his body was. But Jack Cooper wasn't giving her the luxury of a moment's respite. His movements were like lightning, swift and unpredictable. He was still sweating profusely, his body slick, but now it was more than just a physical advantage. It was part of his rhythm, part of the pace of the fight. His sweat was no longer just an irritating byproduct of his fight. It had become an extension of him, almost like a second skin. It was as if every drop that fell off his body gave him just a little more resilience, just a little more strength. Zareth, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the strain of the battle. Her energy was draining fast, her body not designed for prolonged exertion in this way. She had trained for war, for strategic battles that relied on tactics, control, and the precision of a quick strike. This was something entirely different. "You're still in this, Princess," Jack said, his voice casual but with an edge of challenge. He wasn't breathing as heavily as she was. His eyes locked on her every move. The human was relentless. She couldn't deny it. Zareth's mind raced. She needed a plan, a way to turn this fight in her favor. She couldn't outlast him. She couldn't overpower him. So what was left? Outsmart him. Her eyes flicked to the side, her mind already calculating her next move. She had underestimated Jack's sweat before. It wasn't just a barrier. It was a weapon, a tool that gave him the ability to slip out of her grasp, to maintain his momentum. But if she could control the pace of the fight, she could break his rhythm. If she could force him into a corner, then she would have the advantage. She closed the distance between them quickly, her body low to the ground, feinting a left jab. Jack moved instinctively, raising his arm to block, but Zareth had already anticipated it. She shifted, using his own motion against him. With a swift strike, she aimed for the pressure point on his shoulder, hoping to knock him off balance. Jack grunted, his body swaying, but instead of stumbling, he adjusted, his other hand shooting out to catch her wrist. The human wasn't reacting anymore. He was adapting, his movements becoming more fluid, more natural. Every time Zareth thought she had him cornered, he found a way to escape, to turn the tide back in his favor. The crowd's cheers roared in her ears, but Zareth barely heard them now. All she could focus on was Jack. His sweat had become an extension of his defense, his persistence. His body was no longer just resisting her blows. It was deflecting them, bouncing off each strike like a shield made of liquid steel. "You think you've got me figured out, don't you?" Jack said, his voice a low growl. "But you're not there yet. You can't beat me by just hitting harder." Zareth's pulse quickened, frustration mixing with the determination she had cultivated over 1,000 years. She wasn't going to lose to this human. Not like this. She pulled back and took a breath, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed Jack's posture. His sweat, his stamina, was both his strength and his weakness. If she could tire him out, she might be able to strike when he least expected it. And then, a flicker of realization passed through her mind. She hadn't been fighting to win. She had been fighting to survive. But Jack was fighting to adapt, to last. He had endurance, and he had persistence. But if she could turn that persistence against him, make him chase the fight instead of controlling it, then maybe, just maybe, she could win. With a sharp exhale, Zareth launched herself at Jack again, but this time, she didn't go in for a direct attack. She feinted left, making him shift his weight. She pulled back, dodging his retaliatory grab. Each time he lunged for her, she moved just out of reach, using his momentum against him. She was testing him now, testing his ability to keep up with her pace, to keep his energy steady. Jack's sweat glistened, dripping down his skin like water down a waterfall. His breaths were shallow, his body slick with exhaustion. She could see it now. His stamina wasn't limitless. Every drop of sweat that fell from him seemed to take just a little more out of him. His ability to keep fighting was beginning to slip. Zareth saw her opportunity. She surged forward, ducking under his reach and driving her shoulder into his chest. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward, and for the first time in the match, Jack seemed to lose his footing. His sweat-slick skin betrayed him. As he tried to regain his balance, Zareth drove forward, locking him into a hold that left him no room to maneuver. The crowd fell silent as Zareth's grip tightened. Jack struggled, his body slick with sweat, but this time it wasn't enough. His movements were sluggish, his strength waning. Zareth knew it was only a matter of time before he couldn't escape. "Now," she whispered to herself. "Now, I have you." With one final, decisive move, Zareth flipped Jack onto his back, pinning him to the mat. His body trembled, and the fight drained from him like water from a sinking ship. His sweat, that strange, resilient weapon, had finally failed him. Zareth had outlasted him, not by strength, but by endurance of a different kind, strategic endurance. The referee's voice boomed through the arena. "Victory. The match is won by Princess Zareth, champion of Icthar." The crowd erupted into a mixture of shock and admiration. Some cheered. Others murmured in disbelief. Zareth stood over Jack, her chest heaving with exhaustion and triumph. She had done it. She had won. Jack lay beneath her, breathing heavily, but there was no malice in his eyes. He met her gaze with a look of respect. He had fought with everything he had, and she knew deep down that he had pushed her to the limits of her own abilities. "Well played, Princess," Jack said, his voice raspy but genuine. "You earned this." Zareth extended her hand, pulling Jack to his feet. She had defeated him, but she had also learned something invaluable. This human, his sweat, his persistence, his unyielding will, had forced her to think in ways she never had before. Jack Cooper was more than just a human. He was a fighter in a way that was uniquely his own, and Zareth, for the first time, felt true respect for him.